The spreadsheet numbers blurred together somewhere around midnight. Catherine Brennan leaned back in her leather chair, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a month, and watched the city lights stretch across the Dallas skyline like a constellation of ambition. Technova Solutions occupied the top 3 floors of the Preston Tower, and her corner office offered views that magazines photographed for their Women Who Lead features. $3 billion in market valuation. Youngest female CEO in the tech manufacturing sector. The kind of success that made her late father's disapproval feel almost worth it. Her phone buzzed. Grace's face filled the screen, those wide eyes that still held trust Catherine wasn't sure she'd earned. "Mommy, when are you coming home?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Catherine glanced at the conference room where her executive team had left 20 minutes ago, their laughter fading down the hallway toward lives that apparently included dinner with their families. "Soon, sweetheart. Mommy has important work." "Mrs. Martinez left. She said she can't stay past 9 anymore." Catherine's jaw tightened. Third nanny in 18 months. The first had cited incompatible expectations. The second simply stopped showing up. Mrs. Martinez, at least, had the courtesy to resign properly, though apparently not the courtesy to give more than 4 hours' notice. "I'll be down in 15 minutes. We'll order Thai food, okay? Your favorite." Grace's silence spoke louder than complaints. 8 years old and already learning that promises from her mother came with asterisks. "Okay, Mommy." Catherine ended the call and stared at the quarterly projections still glowing on her monitor. Revenue up 18%. Operating costs down 12%. The board would be pleased. Michael would have been proud, if he'd lived to see it. 4 years since the drunk driver had turned their Mercedes into a crushed memory on Interstate 35. 4 years of building this empire while Grace grew up in the margins of her ambition. This is what success looks like, Catherine told herself, gathering files into her Prada briefcase. This is what I built. The mantra felt hollow tonight, but mantras often did at midnight when your daughter waited 3 floors down in an empty break room because the help had abandoned ship. The elevator descent felt longer than usual. Catherine caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. Tailored Armani suit. Hair still perfect despite 14 hours in the office. Makeup holding strong. The armor of competence worn so long she'd forgotten what skin felt like underneath. Grace sat at the break room table, coloring in a book she'd already finished twice. The crayon strokes were angry tonight, pressing so hard the paper buckled. "Ready to go home?" Grace looked up, and something in her expression made Catherine's chest constrict. Not anger, resignation. An 8-year-old shouldn't know resignation. "Can we really get Thai food, or will you have to take another call?" The accuracy of the question stung more than its edge. Catherine knelt down, her expensive skirt protesting against the break room's industrial carpet. "No calls. Just us. I promise." Grace studied her mother's face, searching for truth in the spaces between words. Whatever she found there must have been enough, because she nodded and gathered her things with the efficiency of a child who'd learned to pack up her life in 30-second increments. The underground parking garage hummed with fluorescent silence. Catherine's heels clicked against oil-stained concrete, each step echoing off the rows of vehicles that belonged to people who'd gone home hours ago. Her Mercedes waited in its reserved spot, E1, close to the executive elevator. The proximity felt less like privilege tonight, and more like evidence of how little distance separated her office from this tomb of steel and shadows. Grace's hand found hers, small fingers threading through manicured ones. Catherine squeezed back, a gesture that felt both automatic and foreign. When had she last held her daughter's hand without her phone in the other palm? The 3 men emerged from between a Lexus and a pickup truck. Professional, that was Catherine's first thought. Suits too nice for random violence. Movement too coordinated for opportunity. They spread out with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before, cutting off angles of escape before she could process the need to run. The tallest one smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "Ms. Brennan, working late again." Catherine's self-defense instructor had warned about the freeze response, how the body sometimes chose paralysis over fight or flight, an evolutionary glitch that served no purpose in parking garages at midnight. Her hand tightened on Grace's, pulling her daughter behind her body in a movement that felt both instinctive and inadequate. "I don't know what you want, but my purse is in the car. Take whatever—" "We don't want your purse." The man to her left moved first. Catherine's muscles remembered 3 months of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the classes she'd taken after Michael died, when the world felt too dangerous and control too precious. Her elbow found his solar plexus, a solid hit that should have doubled him over. He grunted, adjusted, and kept coming. Not random thugs. Trained. Grace's screams split the air, high and desperate, and completely unaware that some situations couldn't be solved by calling for help in a garage where everyone had already gone home. "Help my mom! They beat her!" Catherine's vision blurred as knuckles connected with her temple. Her body knew this sensation from exactly once before. The car accident that had taken Michael. That moment between impact and darkness, when the brain acknowledged damage it couldn't prevent. She stumbled, her hip slamming into the Mercedes' door handle, and felt Grace's arms wrap around her waist with the fierce inadequacy of a child trying to shield her mother from the world's brutality. "Everything I built," Catherine thought, as her knees buckled against asphalt that smelled of oil and rubber and the particular desperation of enclosed spaces. "Everything I sacrificed. And it means nothing if I can't protect her." The tallest man grabbed her hair, yanking her head back with casual cruelty. His face filled her dimming vision, features already losing definition as consciousness began its retreat. She needed to learn this lesson. His fist drew back, and Catherine braced for impact that would likely be the last thing she remembered tonight. Grace's sobs formed a soundtrack to failure, the sound of a daughter watching her mother break against superior force. Boot steps on concrete, heavy, deliberate, coming from the maintenance corridor that ran along the garage's west wall. A voice cut through the fluorescent silence, male, carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd calculated violence and found it wanting. "The real lesson is for cowards." Catherine's fading vision caught movement. Navy coveralls, work boots. A man setting down a toolbox with a thud that echoed like punctuation. His hands moved with unhurried precision, removing work gloves to reveal dark skin marked with white scars that crossed his knuckles like rivers carved through stone. When he looked up, his eyes held something Catherine's narrowing consciousness couldn't quite name. Recognition? No. Judgment. Cold and complete. The first attacker moved. The man in coveralls was faster. 5 seconds. Catherine would later learn that's all it took. Her brain processed the choreography in fragments. Pressure point strike, joint lock, body hitting concrete with a wet crack that suggested bones finding angles they weren't designed to discover. The second attacker tried different tactics, pulling something from his jacket that gleamed metallic under harsh lights. The stranger's boot connected with the weapon, sending it skittering under a Toyota. Then his elbow found the man's jaw with surgical precision. The tallest one, the one who'd promised Catherine a lesson, reached for his waistband. He never completed the movement. The stranger closed distance like water filling space, his palm striking the man's shoulder in a way that made Catherine's attacker's entire arm go limp. Confusion froze on his face. Then unconsciousness chased it into darkness as a follow-up strike found his temple, with the exact force required to end the threat without crossing into murder. 3 bodies on oil-stained concrete, breathing but broken, contained. The stranger knelt beside Catherine, and her remaining consciousness tried to catalog details through vision that faded at the edges. African-American, late 30s maybe. Athletic build that his coveralls couldn't quite hide, but his hands drew her attention most. Those scarred knuckles moved with a gentleness that contradicted their capacity for violence, finding the wound at her temple, applying pressure with practiced certainty. "Stay calm. I know how to stop the bleeding." His voice carried the kind of steadiness Catherine associated with doctors, though something about his economy of movement suggested different training. Military, perhaps. The way he assessed her injury without wasted motion, the efficiency with which he positioned her body to prevent shock. Grace's arms still wrapped around her waist, trembling, and the stranger's free hand reached toward his toolbox. "Mommy, wake up." "She's awake, just hurt. You're doing good, keeping her warm." He pulled supplies from the toolbox with the ease of someone who'd done this in worse conditions. Gauze, medical tape, an ice pack that he cracked with one hand while maintaining pressure on Catherine's wound with the other. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting concentration that felt almost meditative in its focus. Catherine tried to speak. Her mouth formed shapes around words that wouldn't quite solidify. Questions swam through consciousness that kept trying to slip away. "Who are you? Why did you help? Do I know you?" That last question stuck, barbed and insistent. Something about his profile felt familiar in ways her damaged brain couldn't process. The set of his jaw, the careful way he avoided looking directly at her face, as if eye contact would complicate something he'd rather keep simple. "Ambulance is coming. I can hear the sirens. You're going to be fine, Ms. Brennan." Ms. Brennan. He knew her name. Catherine's vision swam, trying to focus on features that blurred at the edges. His hands, though. Those scars. White against dark skin. The kind that came from injuries that healed without proper medical attention. His wedding ring finger bore a pale band of skin, the ghost of jewelry removed. Sirens grew closer, wailing through the garage's entrance ramp like the world finally noticing that violence had visited its underground spaces. The stranger's hands never stopped their methodical work. Pressure, assessment, adjustment. The muscle memory of someone who'd stopped bleeding in places where ambulances came too late, or never. Paramedics flooded the garage with their chaos of equipment and urgent voices. Catherine felt herself being transferred to a stretcher, the stranger's hands relinquishing her care to people whose training was written in certifications rather than scars. Grace's voice rose in panic, calling for her mother, and someone with a kind face knelt down to explain that everything would be fine, using the sort of gentle lies adults told children when the truth felt too heavy. Catherine's head rolled to the side, her fading vision catching the stranger as he stood back from the organized chaos. He reached into his coverall pocket, pulled out something small and laminated, and placed it on the stretcher beside her hand. Then he turned toward the maintenance corridor, his toolbox in hand, disappearing into shadows before anyone could ask his name or why a building maintenance worker carried field medical supplies and knew how to disable 3 attackers without breaking stride. The ID badge lay against Catherine's palm, its edges digging into her skin. She couldn't lift her hand to read it. Blood obscured parts of the text, her own blood sticky and cooling against plastic. The world tilted as paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. Grace climbed in beside her, still crying, and Catherine wanted to tell her daughter that everything would be fine, but consciousness had other plans. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her completely was Grace's hand picking up the blood-stained badge, turning it over with the curious precision of a child who needed to understand every piece of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. White ceiling tiles, the smell of antiseptic, machines beeping in rhythms that suggested Catherine's heart was still interested in doing its job. Consciousness returned in layers, each one bringing fresh inventory of pain. Her head throbbed where fists had connected. Her ribs ached from impact with the Mercedes. Her hip would show bruises that matched the door handle's geometry. Grace slept in the chair beside her hospital bed, curled into herself like a question mark. The afternoon light suggested Catherine had lost more than just a night. Her hand moved to the IV line, fingers tracing plastic tubing back to bags that dripped clear fluid into her veins. The door opened. A man in a detective's cheap suit entered with the particular weariness of someone whose job involved asking questions that rarely yielded comfortable answers. He introduced himself as Detective Martinez, no relation to the departed nanny, and pulled out a notepad that had seen better decades. "Ms. Brennan, glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I lost a fight." "You were attacked by 3 men in your building's garage. Do you remember that?" Catherine nodded, wincing as the movement reminded her skull that it had sustained trauma. "Can you describe the attackers?" She could, in broad strokes. Professional, trained, the kind of violence that came with purpose rather than rage. Martinez wrote it all down, his pen scratching against paper in a sound that felt too loud for the room's hush. "What about your rescuer?" The question shifted something in Catherine's chest. The stranger. Navy coveralls. Scarred hands that had known exactly how to stop bleeding in the 6 minutes before paramedics arrived. "I couldn't see him clearly. It was dark, and I was fading." "We pulled security footage. Someone in a maintenance uniform, but he kept his face angled away from cameras. Knew where they were. Professional awareness." Martinez reached into his jacket and pulled out an evidence bag. Inside, sealed behind plastic, lay the blood-stained ID badge. "He left this on your stretcher. Mean anything to you?" Catherine's hand shook as she took the bag. The blood had dried to brown, obscuring parts of the text, but enough remained visible to stop her breath in her throat. James Morrison, Head of Safety, Technova Solutions. The name hit like a second assault. Catherine's vision blurred, but this time from tears rather than head trauma. Her mind raced backward through 2 years of decisions, board meetings, the particular afternoon when Richard Wallace had recommended termination for an employee who'd violated protocol during a critical incident. She'd never met James Morrison, never asked his side of the story, just signed the papers Wallace had prepared, the ones that cited insubordination and destruction of company property valued at $7 million. "Safety is about systems, not cowboys," she'd written in the termination memo. Technova can't retain employees who prioritize personal judgment over established protocols. And now this. The man she'd destroyed, whose career she'd ended with her signature, had saved her life in a parking garage, while everyone else who should have been there had gone home to their families. "Brennan, you okay?" Catherine realized she was crying, hot tears cutting tracks down her face that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the particular shame of realizing you've been wrong about something fundamental. About someone. About the distance between leadership and humanity. "I know him. I knew of him. He used to work for Technova." "Used to?" "I fired him. 2 years ago." Martinez's pen paused mid-stroke. His eyes found hers, reading implications she couldn't hide. "You fired him, and he saved your life?" "Yes." The detective closed his notepad, the gesture suggesting he'd found an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. "He disappeared before we could get a statement. Left no contact information. The address on that badge is outdated. Administrative building that's been closed for 18 months. Any idea where we might find him?" Catherine shook her head, though part of her brain was already working through the problem. Human Resources would have his last known address, payroll records. She could find him if she wanted to. But the question lodged deeper was whether she had any right to, whether gratitude gave her permission to enter the life of a man she'd systematically dismantled. Martinez left with promises to follow up, and Catherine sat in the hospital room's sterile silence, turning the evidence bag over in her hands. Grace stirred, her eyes opening to find her mother awake and crying. "Mommy? Does it hurt?" Everything hurt, but not in ways an 8-year-old could understand. Catherine pulled her daughter close, careful of IV lines and bruised ribs, and held her with the fierce inadequacy of someone who'd failed at the one thing that mattered. "I'm okay, baby. I'm okay." But she wasn't. Not really. Because somewhere in Dallas, a man she'd fired without ever meeting him had deemed her life worth saving, despite every reason he had to walk past that parking garage and let violence teach its own lessons. Catherine spent the next day in the hospital, submitting to scans that revealed concussion but no fracture, bruising but no internal bleeding. Grace refused to leave her side, even when nurses suggested the girl might be more comfortable in the family waiting area. Some traumas, Catherine recognized, bonded people in ways that safety couldn't sever. They released her with prescriptions and instructions to rest, concepts Catherine had always treated as optional. But when she returned to her penthouse, the space felt wrong, too big, too empty. The city lights that usually meant success tonight just meant distance from everything that mattered. Grace went to bed early, exhausted from fear and hospital chairs. Catherine sat at her home office desk, the one that looked out over Dallas's glittering sprawl, and opened her laptop with hands that still trembled from adrenaline aftershocks. James Morrison's personnel file loaded with the bureaucratic efficiency of corporate record-keeping. She'd never opened it before. Never needed to. Wallace's recommendation had been enough, his smooth presentation painting a picture of an employee who'd gone rogue during a crisis, destroyed millions in equipment because he'd prioritized personal heroics over protocol. But now, reading through the details Wallace had glossed over, Catherine felt nausea that had nothing to do with concussion. James Morrison, age 38, former Navy SEAL, decorated for valor in operations that remained classified. Honorable discharge after 8 years of service. Hired by Technova 6 years ago as a safety specialist. Promoted to head of safety within 18 months, based on performance reviews that used words like exemplary and transformative. Married to Rachel Morrison, deceased 3 years prior from metastatic breast cancer. Daughter Sophie Morrison, age 8, the same age as Grace. Catherine's throat tightened. A widower raising a daughter alone while working a job that had demanded 60-hour weeks and constant travel between Technova's 5 manufacturing facilities. She scrolled through performance reviews that documented a man who'd revolutionized their safety protocols, reduced workplace injuries by 42%, implemented training programs that other companies had tried to poach. Then the Texas incident. 2 years ago. The report loaded with Wallace's signature at the bottom, his smooth prose painting the picture of chaos. Manufacturing plant explosion during equipment upgrade. Technician Tom Bennett trapped beneath collapsed shelving, flames spreading from damaged electrical systems. Protocol dictated securing prototype equipment first, evacuation second. Total losses? $7 million in proprietary technology. Cause of loss? James Morrison's insubordination. Morrison ignored direct orders to secure equipment, instead attempting rescue of Bennett. Bennett survived with second-degree burns. Morrison sustained hand injuries. Equipment destroyed beyond recovery. Recommendation? Immediate termination for violation of emergency protocols and insubordination during critical incident. Catherine's hands shook as she opened the next document. Tom Bennett's incident report, the one that hadn't made it into Wallace's neat summary. The safety systems were already offline when the explosion occurred. I'd reported the interlocks were disabled for maintenance, but was told to continue work anyway because we were behind schedule. When the fire started, I got trapped. Morrison pulled me out. He saved my life. The equipment was already compromised by the maintenance shortcuts. It was going to be destroyed regardless. Catherine read the paragraph 3 times, her mind trying to reconcile the narrative Wallace had sold with the truth Bennett had documented. Then she found the email chain, buried deep in archived files that someone had marked for deletion but hadn't quite gotten around to purging. From Richard Wallace. To Texas Plant Management. Equipment upgrade timeline. Production deadline cannot slip. Recommend expediting safety bypass procedures to maintain schedule. Prototype equipment must be operational for client demonstration Friday. Authorize minimal crew, maximum efficiency approach. The email was dated 3 days before the explosion. Catherine's vision blurred as she scrolled through the responses. Plant managers pushing back. Wallace overriding their concerns with the smooth confidence of someone whose quarterly bonuses depended on meeting deadlines regardless of corners cut. And when it all went wrong, when Bennett nearly died and millions of dollars of equipment melted into slag, Wallace had found his scapegoat. The man who'd ignored protocol, who'd chosen human life over company property, who'd made Wallace's shortcuts visible by their very absence. James Morrison, who'd saved a man's life and lost everything because Catherine had signed papers without asking questions. She closed the laptop, her hands finding her face, fingers pressing against eyes that burned with the particular shame of willful blindness. How many other times had she trusted Wallace's smooth presentations? How many other lives had she impacted without bothering to dig beneath the surface of convenient narratives? Her phone buzzed. Bradley, her assistant, always awake at hours when normal people slept, saw the news about the attack. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" Catherine stared at the text, considering needs that couldn't be met by corporate assistants or hospital discharges. She typed slowly, each word feeling heavy with implications she wasn't ready to examine. "I need James Morrison's current address. Personal matter. Discreet." Bradley's response came within minutes. Always efficient, always ready to serve. Morrison Auto Repair, 2847 Industrial Boulevard. He owns it. Want me to schedule a meeting? No. I'll go myself. Catherine sat in her Mercedes across from Morrison Auto Repair for 20 minutes before finding courage she usually reserved for boardroom battles. The shop occupied a converted warehouse in the neighborhood where success meant staying open, not expanding. 2 garage bays, hand-painted sign, the kind of honest business that survived on reputation rather than marketing. Through the open bay, she could see him. James Morrison, kneeling beside an old Chevy, his dark hands moving with practiced precision through its engine. He'd changed from the coveralls of the parking garage into jeans and a t-shirt that revealed the athletic build his work clothes had hidden. But his hands drew her attention most. Those scars she'd glimpsed in her fading consciousness, now visible in afternoon light. White marks crossing dark knuckles like a map of violence survived. A little girl sat on a wooden stool beside him, her legs swinging, a coloring book spread across her lap. Biracial, Catherine noted, taking in the combination of features that suggested James's late wife had been white. The girl looked up periodically to ask questions, and James would answer without stopping his work, patient in ways that made Catherine's chest tighten with recognition of everything she wasn't with Grace. Catherine watched their interaction, the easy rhythm of a father and daughter who'd built something real from the ashes of loss. Sophie would lean over to see what her father was doing, and he'd explain with a kind of genuine respect that treated an 8-year-old's curiosity as worthy of adult patience. No talking down, no dismissiveness. Just a man teaching his daughter that the world made sense if you took time to understand its mechanics. The contrast with her own relationship with Grace cut deeper than any fist had managed in the parking garage. Finally, Catherine opened her car door. The industrial boulevard smelled of motor oil and hot asphalt, the particular perfume of working-class neighborhoods where people fixed things instead of replacing them. Her heels clicked against cracked pavement as she crossed the street, each step feeling like walking toward judgment she'd earned but never faced. James looked up as her shadow crossed his workspace. No surprise in his expression, just flat acknowledgement, as if he'd known she'd come eventually and had decided not to waste energy on anticipation. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago given up any pretense of cleanliness. His eyes met hers with the kind of direct gaze that saw through armor Catherine had spent decades perfecting. "I came to thank you." His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Thanks won't make wounds heal faster." The words landed with the weight of someone who'd had 2 years to refine his response to an encounter he must have imagined countless times. Catherine swallowed against a throat that felt too tight, awareness creeping in, that gratitude wouldn't bridge the distance her signature had created. I looked into your file. The Texas incident. You signed the papers. I remember. The interruption cut clean, and Catherine found herself standing in sudden silence that felt both heavy and deserved. Around them, the sounds of the auto shop formed a soundtrack to discomfort. Pneumatic tools hissing, radio playing country music, the particular symphony of honest work continuing despite personal drama that felt too small against its backdrop. Sophie jumped down from her stool, her face bright with the uncomplicated warmth of a child who hadn't yet learned to guard her heart against the world's casual cruelties.
Dad, is this the brave lady you saved?
Catherine knelt to Sophie's level, taking in her father's calm intelligence in her eyes, her late mother's warmth in the curve of her smile. The girl looked at Catherine with the kind of open curiosity that expected goodness because she'd been raised by a man who'd chosen mercy over bitterness. Your dad's the brave one.
I know. He was a soldier before, and he showed me how to make bandages and stop bleeding and everything.
Sophie beamed with uncomplicated pride, and Catherine felt something inside her chest break in a way that had nothing to do with cracked ribs and everything to do with the distance between who she was and who she should have been. This little girl was proud of a father Catherine had tried to destroy, a man who'd lost his wife to cancer and his career to Catherine's signature, and still managed to build a relationship with his daughter that Catherine couldn't achieve with all her wealth and power. James's hand settled on Sophie's shoulder, gentle but firm. Why don't you go finish your homework in the office, kiddo? I need to talk to Ms. Brennan. Sophie gathered her coloring book with the efficiency of a child accustomed to adult conversations that required privacy. She paused at the office door, turning back to wave at Catherine with the sort of generous spirit that made guilt taste sharper. When they were alone, James's expression hardened into something that fell short of anger, but exceeded simple annoyance. He crossed his arms, a defensive posture that his military bearing made look more like tactical assessment than emotional retreat. Why did you really come here, Ms. Brennan? Catherine stood, her expensive skirt out of place against oil-stained concrete, her polished exterior a poor disguise for the turmoil churning beneath. Because I found irregularities in safety records at our Chicago plant. Patterns of violations being buried, and I think the Texas explosion wasn't Tom Bennett's fault. James's jaw tightened, the only outward sign that her words had landed. No, it wasn't. The confirmation hung between them, heavy with implications Catherine was only beginning to process. She pulled out her phone, opened the email she'd found, and turned the screen toward him. James's eyes scanned Wallace's message, the one that authorized safety bypasses for the sake of production schedules, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. But you already knew that, didn't you? I testified about it, submitted a full report. Wallace buried it and blamed Tom, then blamed me for choosing a human life over company property. Catherine's throat constricted around words that felt too small for the magnitude of her failure. I never saw your report. Wallace said you'd violated protocol, destroyed equipment, made yourself a liability. I trusted his presentation. I never... She trailed off, the rest of the sentence too damning to complete. I never asked your side. I never investigated. I just signed papers that destroyed your career because it was easier than questioning the narrative that aligned with my desire to appear decisive. James studied her face, reading truths she couldn't quite voice. You never even met me, did you? Just signed papers Wallace put in front of you. No. The admission tasted like ash. Catherine had built her career on being thorough, on understanding every decision before committing. But when it came to human consequences, she delegated that understanding to people like Wallace, trusting their smooth competence because questioning would have required effort she deemed better spent elsewhere. That's the problem with people at the top. You forget there are human beings at the bottom of your decisions. The words struck with surgical precision, cutting through Catherine's defenses to touch something she'd been avoiding since she'd read his name on that blood-stained badge. She wasn't just wrong about the Texas incident. She was wrong about the entire architecture of her leadership. The system she'd built that made it easy to destroy lives without ever looking them in the eye. Before she could formulate a response that might have approached adequate, her phone rang. Bradley's name flashed on the screen, and Catherine answered with the automatic efficiency of someone whose assistant only called during off hours when emergencies demanded attention. Ms. Brennan, I'm at the office. There are files you need to see. Wallace has been... The screech of tires drowned out Bradley's voice. Catherine spun toward the sound, her body moving before her brain processed the threat. A dark sedan accelerated toward the open garage bay where she and James stood, its engine roaring with a particular violence of intention rather than accident. James reacted with combat reflexes Catherine's self-defense classes had never approached. His arm shot out, shoving her sideways with enough force to send her stumbling into a tool cabinet. In the same motion, he lunged toward the office where Sophie had gone, his body already transitioning from conversation to protection before the sedan's grille crossed the garage threshold. Metal screamed. The car smashed into the bay entrance, sending tools and parts flying in an explosion of chaos that painted the world in flying steel. The vehicle reversed with equal violence, its transmission grinding, and sped away before Catherine could process anything beyond the animal panic of survival. She found herself curled against the tool cabinet, her hands protecting her head, her body remembering the parking garage attack and choosing defensive posture over coherent thought. James crouched in the office doorway, his arms wrapped around Sophie, his back to the devastation, placing his body between his daughter and whatever threat the world had decided to deliver. Silence settled over the wreckage, broken only by the sedan's fading engine and the particular quiet that follows violence. James moved first, checking Sophie with methodical precision, his hands gentle despite the tremor Catherine could see in his fingers. The little girl appeared remarkably composed for someone who just survived a vehicle attack, her face pressed against her father's chest, breathing steady despite obvious fear. "You okay?" His question addressed Catherine, his tone carrying the same battlefield calm that had characterized their parking garage encounter. She nodded, though her hands shook as she pushed herself upright, checking for damage beyond the bruises she'd collect from her collision with the tool cabinet. A piece of paper lay on the garage floor, weighted down with a spark plug. Catherine picked it up with trembling fingers, reading words printed in plain black letters that carried no ambiguity about their message. "Stop investigating, or next time there won't be a warning." She stared at the note, her brain trying to connect dots that formed a pattern uglier than corporate malfeasance. Wallace knew she was digging, knew she'd found the emails, and had escalated from parking garage beatings to attempted vehicular assault without the courtesy of increasing severity gradually. James appeared at her shoulder, reading the message over her arm. His expression shifted into something that would have terrified her if it had been directed at her instead of at whoever had just crashed a car into his workplace while his daughter played inside. This wasn't random. No. And the parking garage? Probably not either. They stood in the destroyed garage bay, surrounded by scattered tools and automotive parts, while the truth settled over them like concrete dust. Catherine had kicked something larger than safety violations, had threatened someone powerful enough to order violence without hesitation, someone who viewed 3,000-pound vehicles as acceptable tools for silencing inconvenient questions. The police arrived with their bureaucratic efficiency, taking statements that felt increasingly futile as Catherine recognized the officer's barely concealed skepticism. "Hit and run, ma'am, probably teenagers. We'll file a report." The dismissiveness stung more than the attack, the casual way they minimized attempted murder into youthful recklessness. After the police departed, James began cleaning up the damage with methodical determination, each movement precise, despite obvious fury thrumming beneath his surface calm. Catherine watched him work, seeing the military discipline that allowed him to function through crisis by focusing on immediate tasks that needed completion. "I'm sorry." He paused, his hands full of scattered socket wrenches. "For which part? Firing me, or nearly getting my daughter killed?" The words struck with the force of truth Catherine had no defense against. Both. Neither. Everything that had led to this moment, where her investigation had brought violence to his doorstep, where her failures 2 years ago had created the circumstances that allowed Wallace to operate with impunity. All of it. James set down the tools, his dark eyes finding hers with intensity that made looking away feel like cowardice. I think Richard Wallace has been covering up safety violations for years, and I think people have died because of it. The statement hung between them, transforming their interaction from personal grievance to something larger. Catherine pulled out her phone, opening the files Bradley had compiled, the ones that showed inspection reports falsified across 5 Technova facilities, safety violations systematically buried, a pattern of negligence that suggested the Texas incident was an aberration, but standard operating procedure. James took the phone, scrolling through documents that painted a picture of corporate corruption deep enough to drown in. His expression darkened as he read, muscles tightening across his shoulders in ways that suggested violence barely restrained. How many? Violations? Hundreds across 5 years. Deaths. The question froze Catherine's breath in her throat. Deaths. She hadn't gotten that far in her investigation, hadn't connected the dots between safety failures and human casualties. But James had, his military mind already running calculations Catherine's business training had never equipped her to consider. I don't know. Then that's where we start. The next morning brought consequences Catherine had anticipated, but hoped to delay. The board called an emergency meeting, and she walked into Technova's executive conference room to find Richard Wallace already standing at the head of the table, his smooth face arranged into concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind him, projected on the massive screen, security footage showed Catherine handing documents to Bradley in the parking garage, then Bradley passing those same documents to James. The editing was professional, the implications clear. Ah, Catherine, we were just discussing a concerning security breach. Wallace's voice carried the oily smoothness of someone who'd rehearsed this moment, who'd anticipated Catherine's investigation and prepared countermeasures that would make her the villain in a story he controlled. Around the table, 12 board members watched with expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. Catherine took her seat at the opposite end, maintaining composure despite her racing heart. She'd faced hostile takeover attempts, shareholder revolts, market crashes, but this felt different, personal. Wallace wasn't just protecting his career. He was destroying hers with the same casual efficiency she'd once brought to signing his termination recommendations. What's the concern, Richard? Confidential company documents appear to be finding their way into unauthorized hands. Specifically, the hands of a disgruntled former employee you terminated for cause. The way he emphasized terminated, the slight smile that accompanied the word, made Catherine's jaw clench. Wallace knew exactly what he was doing. Painting her investigation as personal vendetta, her search for truth as corporate espionage. Janet Winters, the board's most senior member, leaned forward with the careful neutrality of someone trying to navigate political waters without capsizing. What exactly are you investigating, Catherine? Before Catherine could answer, Wallace interjected with practiced smoothness. She's sharing sensitive company information with James Morrison, who was terminated 2 years ago for violating safety protocols. A man with obvious grudge against this company. I'm investigating a pattern of safety violations and subsequent cover-ups at multiple Technova facilities. Catherine's voice carried steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She pulled out her own laptop, projected her findings onto a second screen. Emails, inspection reports, the paper trail Wallace had thought buried deep enough to stay hidden. Violations that put our workers at risk and expose our company to serious legal jeopardy. Murmurs spread around the table like ripples across disturbed water. Wallace's smile faltered slightly, cracks appearing in his carefully constructed facade. And what does this have to do with James Morrison? The question came from Michael Reeves, another board member, and Catherine recognized the trap it represented. Any answer that acknowledged James's expertise would validate Wallace's narrative about her judgment being compromised. Any answer that minimized his role would dishonor the truth she'd come here to defend. Mr. Morrison was wrongfully terminated after the Texas incident. He was made a scapegoat for decisions made by others. She let the pause hang, then delivered the blow Wallace must have known was coming. Specifically, decisions to bypass safety systems during an equipment upgrade. Decisions made by Mr. Wallace. The room erupted into controlled chaos, board members speaking over each other, Wallace's face hardening into something that transformed his urbane mask into naked hostility. Years of professional courtesy burned away in mutual recognition that war had been declared, that the polite fiction of corporate collegiality had shattered against truth's sharper edges. Janet Winters raised her hand, calling for order with the authority of someone who'd been navigating boardroom battles since before most of them had graduated business school. I think we should continue this discussion in executive session. Richard, Catherine, please give us the room. Outside in the hallway, Wallace cornered Catherine by the water cooler, his smooth facade completely shattered now. You're making a serious mistake. You have no idea what you're meddling with. Catherine stepped closer, refusing intimidation in her own building. I know exactly what I'm doing, Richard. Cleaning up my company. His expression darkened into something that sent ice down her spine, a glimpse of the violence lurking beneath his corporate polish. Your company. Don't forget who brought you in. Who mentored you? Who made you? He didn't make me, Richard. You used me. There's a difference. She moved past him toward the elevators, her hands steady despite the fear thrumming through her veins. Behind her, Wallace's voice carried quiet menace that promised escalation. The board won't side with you on this. You're throwing away your career on a crusade based on speculation and the word of a man we fired for insubordination. Maybe, but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. The elevator doors closed on Wallace's furious expression, and Catherine leaned against the polished steel wall, her composure finally cracking now that she was alone. Her phone buzzed. Bradley. Board voted. You're suspended pending investigation. Corporate accounts frozen. Building access revoked in 48 hours. Catherine stared at the text, watching her empire crumble in real time. Suspended. Frozen. Revoked. The vocabulary of exile, delivered in corporate efficiency that made homelessness sound like administrative procedure. When she reached the penthouse that evening, Grace looked up from homework with the particular perception children developed when their world kept shifting beneath them. Mommy, are we in trouble? Catherine knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close with the fierce desperation of someone who'd finally recognized what mattered only as it slipped away. Just some work problems, sweetheart. We might need to stay somewhere else for a few days. Like where? Catherine didn't have an answer. Most of her liquid assets were tied up in company stock she couldn't access without triggering notifications that would alert Wallace to her movements. Her friends were business associates who would distance themselves now that her career faced contamination. The penthouse itself would be reclaimed within 48 hours, part of her compensation package she'd never imagined needing to worry about. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered with the wariness of someone who'd learned that phone calls at odd hours rarely brought good news. Ms. Brennan, I saw the news about your suspension. James Morrison's voice carried concern that felt unearned given everything Catherine had done to him. They've locked me out of everything. Frozen accounts, revoked building access. We have 48 hours to vacate the penthouse. Silence on the line. Then his voice, softer than before. I have a pull-out couch. It's not fancy, but it's clean. And Sophie would be thrilled to have Grace around. The offer landed like absolution Catherine knew she didn't deserve. After everything, after destroying his career and bringing violence to his garage and investigating on the backs of his suffering, James Morrison was offering her shelter. I can't impose. It's not imposing if it's offered freely. You helped me see the truth about Wallace. Let me help you stay safe while you fight for it. Catherine stood at his apartment door 36 hours later, 2 suitcases containing what remained of her life after the movers had reclaimed everything else. Grace stood beside her, clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since infancy, her face arranged into brave confusion about why they were visiting the mechanic who'd saved Mommy instead of going to their real home. James opened the door, took in their luggage and Catherine's carefully maintained composure, and stepped aside without comment. "Come in." Catherine crossed the threshold into his modest apartment, her expensive clothes ridiculous against worn but clean furniture, family photos on walls, the particular warmth of a space that had known loss and rebuilt anyway. Behind her, the door closed on the life she'd spent 2 decades building. Grace's voice, small and uncertain, broke the silence.
Are we going to live here now?
James knelt to her level, his scarred hands gentle as he helped her with her suitcase. "Just for a little while. Sophie's excited to have you. She's been setting up the guest room all morning." Catherine stood in the living room that could have fit inside her old penthouse's walk-in closet, surrounded by the evidence of everything she'd lost and everything she'd never had. On the coffee table, Sophie's coloring book lay open to a page showing 4 stick figures holding hands. James followed her gaze. She drew that this morning. Said it was her family now. You and Grace, me and her. Catherine's throat tightened around words that wouldn't form. She had nothing left but the mercy of a man she'd wronged, shelter offered by someone who had every reason to let her learn what suffering felt like when you faced it without resources or power. "I don't deserve your help." James's expression softened into something that looked almost like forgiveness, though Catherine knew she hadn't earned that yet. Probably not. But Grace deserves to be safe. He glanced toward the bedroom where Sophie's voice called for Grace to come see the bunk beds they'd share. "Come in, Catherine. You're home." The pull-out couch smelled faintly of laundry detergent and honest poverty. Catherine lay awake in the darkness, listening to the apartment's unfamiliar sounds, water pipes creaking, the neighbor's television through thin walls, Grace's breathing from the bedroom she now shared with Sophie, the 2 girls having bonded with the speed of children who recognized shared trauma and chose companionship over fear. Catherine's Armani suit hung in the cramped closet beside James's work coveralls, the juxtaposition so absurd it felt like commentary on every choice she'd made for 20 years. Her life reduced to 2 suitcases and the mercy of a man whose career she'd destroyed with a signature that had taken less than 30 seconds to produce. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and something burning. Catherine pulled on yesterday's clothes, her dry cleaning schedule now as irrelevant as her executive parking space, and found James in the kitchen attempting pancakes while both girls supervised with the serious attention of quality control inspectors. "Dad, that one's smoking." Sophie pointed at the griddle where batter had transformed into charcoal. James flipped it with practiced efficiency, revealing blackened destruction that suggested his combat skills translated poorly to breakfast preparation. "So it is. Who wants the crispy one?" Grace giggled, a sound Catherine hadn't heard in months, maybe years. Her daughter sat at the small table in pajamas borrowed from Sophie, her hair unbrushed, her face bright with a particular joy of children who'd discovered that disaster could be funny if you approached it right. "I'll take it." Grace's voice carried the brave generosity of someone offering to eat charred food to spare others, and James slid the ruined pancake onto her plate with the gravity of a Michelin chef presenting his finest work. "Excellent choice. The carbon adds texture." Catherine watched from the doorway, cataloging this domestic scene that shouldn't work, but did. James moved through the cramped kitchen with efficiency born from years of single parenthood, Sophie handing him ingredients before he asked, Grace setting the table without prompting. The rhythm they'd established overnight spoke to something Catherine had never built with her daughter, despite penthouse space and unlimited resources. "Coffee?" James offered the question without looking at her, his attention focused on pouring batter that would hopefully fare better than its predecessor. Catherine accepted the mug he handed her, noting its chipped handle and faded logo from a business that had probably closed before Grace was born. "Thank you. For this. For everything." Her words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what he was offering. Shelter. Safety. A model of fatherhood that made her own parenting look like corporate obligation rather than human connection. James finally met her eyes, his expression unreadable in the morning light filtering through windows that needed washing. Grace needed somewhere safe. So did you. The simplicity of his statement hit harder than elaborate explanations would have. He wasn't offering redemption or forgiveness or any of the complicated emotional economics Catherine might have anticipated. Just shelter for a child and the mother who'd failed her in ways beyond counting. They ate breakfast together, Catherine forcing down pancakes that tasted like failure and second chances. The girls chattered about their plan to build a fort in Sophie's room, their voices bright with the resilience of children who could find joy in cardboard boxes and shared secrets. James cleaned up with methodical efficiency, teaching both girls to wash dishes properly, explaining water conservation and the importance of hot rinse cycles in terms that made domestic chores sound like scientific principles worth understanding. Catherine watched him teach, seeing the patience she'd never developed with Grace. He didn't talk down to the girls, didn't dismiss their questions or rush through explanations because adult schedules demanded efficiency over comprehension. Each inquiry received serious consideration, whether it concerned soap temperature, or why bubbles formed, or how water traveled through pipes that lived inside walls. "You want to know what I learned as a SEAL?" His question arrived after the dishes were finished and the girls had disappeared into Sophie's room armed with blankets and architectural ambitions. Catherine sat on the couch that had been her bed, its cushions still bearing the impression of her sleepless night. "How to fight?" James settled into the armchair across from her, morning light catching the white scars across his dark knuckles. "How to protect. There's a difference. Fighting is easy. Any fool with fists can throw punches. Knowing who to protect and why. Understanding that some battles aren't worth winning if you lose what matters in the process. That takes wisdom most people never develop." His words settled over Catherine like weight she'd been avoiding. She thought of the battles she'd chosen over the past 2 decades. Market share fights, quarterly earnings wars, board politics that consumed weekends and holidays and every moment that might have been spent with Grace. Victories that looked impressive in business journals, but felt hollow in hospital rooms and police stations, and moments when your daughter asked when you were coming home. "I've been fighting the wrong battles." The admission slipped out before Catherine could guard against it. James's expression softened into something that might have been understanding or might have been pity. She couldn't tell which would hurt less. Most people do. Takes losing everything to figure out what was worth protecting all along. That night, after Grace had gone to bed wearing Sophie's spare pajamas, and Catherine had tried to make herself useful by failing to cook dinner that James politely salvaged, she found him teaching both girls first aid in the living room. Medical supplies spread across the coffee table like equipment for a training exercise, which Catherine supposed it was. Sophie demonstrated on Grace with the confidence of someone who'd practiced these skills until they became reflex. "If someone's bleeding, press here. Don't panic. Panic makes you stupid, and stupid gets people hurt." Grace absorbed the instruction with focused attention, her small hands mimicking Sophie's placement on the demonstration wound. Catherine watched from the kitchen, struck by the contrast with how she'd approached Grace's education. Piano lessons the nanny supervised, tutors who taught French conjugations Grace would never use, summer camps designed to build resumes for college applications still a decade away. James had taught his daughter how to save lives. Catherine had taught hers how to perform for admissions committees. "Why are you teaching them this?" The question emerged quieter than Catherine intended. James looked up from where he knelt between the girls, his scarred hands guiding theirs through proper bandage technique. "Because I can't always be there to protect them. Best I can do is make sure they know how to protect themselves and each other." His answer contained philosophy Catherine's business school had never touched. Competence over dependence, skills over connections, The radical notion that preparing children for the world's dangers might matter more than shielding them from discomfort. The girls finished their lesson and retreated to Sophie's room, their voices drifting back in whispers about building hospitals in their blanket fort. Catherine sat beside James on the couch, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. "I need to get into Wallace's office." Her statement landed flat, practical, devoid of the emotion churning beneath. James's expression shifted into tactical assessment, the military strategist emerging from behind the single father's patience. "Breaking into your own company? It's not mine anymore." Catherine considered his question, examining motivations she hadn't fully articulated to herself. Revenge would be simple, vindication would be satisfying, but neither captured what had been building since she'd read Tom Bennett's incident report, since she'd understood the scope of Wallace's corruption and her own complicity in enabling it. "Because people are getting hurt, and it's my fault for not seeing it sooner." The words felt like confession, like the first honest assessment of her leadership she'd made in years. Not because she'd been malicious, because she'd been willfully blind, trusting smooth presentations over uncomfortable questions, rewarding results without examining methods. James studied her face, searching for sincerity beneath corporate polish that had started to crack. "Then we need evidence that can't be explained away. Documents, files, something concrete enough that Wallace can't spin his way out." Over the next week, James taught Catherine skills her MBA had never covered: lockpicking using tension wrenches and bent paper clips, security camera blind spots, how to move through buildings without triggering motion sensors, the particular rhythm of breath control that kept hands steady when breaking laws felt like the only path to justice. They practiced in his apartment after the girls went to sleep, Catherine's expensive manicure suffering as she learned to feel tumblers through metal tools. Her first successful lockpick took 40 minutes. By the end of the week, she could manage it in under 90 seconds. "You're a good student," James offered the compliment without irony, watching her reset the practice lock for another attempt. Catherine's hands ached from unfamiliar work, her fingers developing calluses in places that had never known physical labor. "I spent my whole life learning things that don't matter. This feels real." It is real, and it's dangerous. Wallace has already shown he's willing to use violence. If we get caught, we won't. Catherine's certainty surprised even herself. But something had shifted during these nights of criminal education, these days of watching James build competence in his daughter while her own parenting failures spread like stains across memory. She'd been caught by comfortable narratives long enough. Time to become the kind of person who broke into offices for truth instead of signing papers that buried it. The night they chose arrived with autumn rain that would keep security patrols focused on staying dry rather than checking shadows. Catherine dressed in dark clothes borrowed from James, her corporate armor replaced by practical cotton that wouldn't reflect light. Grace and Sophie slept at Jake Morrison's house, James's former SEAL teammate who'd agreed to watch them with the casual competence of someone accustomed to protecting things that mattered. Technova's executive floor waited in darkness, its polished hallways empty of the people who'd populated Catherine's former life. They'd entered through the service entrance, using a key card James's security contact had provided, the 20-minute window ticking down with each breath. Wallace's office door yielded to Catherine's lockpicks after 2 minutes of work that felt like hours. The mechanism clicked, and she pushed inside, her heart hammering against ribs that still ached from the parking garage beating. James took position by the door, his posture alert, reading the building's rhythms with senses Catherine would never develop. She moved to Wallace's desk, settling into his chair with the strange intimacy of occupying space that had witnessed countless decisions she'd never questioned. The computer required a password. Catherine typed letters and numbers she'd observed during board meetings when Wallace had been careless about screen angles. Everest 74. His annual climbing trip, the one he photographed extensively for social media while claiming it taught him about persistence and summit mentality. The desktop appeared, and Catherine began searching with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood corporate file structures. Wallace kept everything organized, his digital life as meticulously maintained as his public image. Employee files, project reports, financial projections that looked clean until you understood what they concealed. She found the folder labeled Insurance Policies, buried 3 levels deep in administrative records. Inside, dozens of files named for Technova employees, each containing the kind of personal information that transformed human beings into leverage points. Tom Bennett's file detailed his daughter's medical expenses, the settlement that had bought his silence, the side letter specifying that his money was contingent on testimony that blamed James for the Texas explosion. Reading the cold calculation of how Wallace had weaponized a father's desperation made Catherine's stomach twist. Her own file contained surveillance photos spanning months. Catherine and Grace leaving the penthouse, Catherine at board meetings, Grace at school pickup. Transcripts of private conversations that suggested Wallace had been monitoring her communications long before she'd started investigating. He'd been building a case, preparing for the moment when she might become a problem that required containment. The photos of Grace burned hottest. Her daughter on the playground, unaware that someone was documenting her movements. Grace at the school entrance, vulnerable in ways Catherine had never imagined when she'd thought wealth provided security. He was going to use my... The hidden safe revealed itself after Catherine examined the office with the careful attention of someone who'd worked in the building for years and never noticed details that mattered. Behind Wallace's framed photograph of himself on Everest's summit, a wall panel concealed steel and combination locks. James approached with tools from his tactical past, devices Catherine didn't ask about. The safe opened after 12 minutes that aged her a decade. Inside, a single USB drive labeled Medical Devices Archive. Catherine plugged it into Wallace's computer, her breath catching as files loaded. Engineering reports, cost-benefit analyses, email chains that documented Wallace receiving warnings about design flaws in cardiac monitoring devices Technova manufactured for hospital systems across 14 states. The math was simple and monstrous. Recalls would cost $340 million. Lawsuits from device failures would likely settle for $80 million. Wallace's recommendation, preserved in his own handwriting across the analysis. Let them sue. Cheaper to pay survivors than fix design issues. Below the analysis, a spreadsheet listed names. 17 confirmed deaths, ages ranging from 28 to 74. Dates of device failure. Settlement amounts paid to families bound by non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from warning others about defective equipment that continued shipping while Wallace calculated acceptable losses. Catherine scrolled through the names, her vision blurring as she absorbed the human cost of decisions she'd never known about but should have prevented. Margaret Hayes, 43, mother of 2. David Chen, 61, retired teacher. Sarah Williams, 35, pregnant with her second child. On and on, the debt accumulated in spreadsheet cells that reduced lives to line items in Wallace's risk assessment. I built the company that killed these people. Her voice broke on the admission. James's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady against the trembling that had started somewhere deep in Catherine's core. You didn't know. I should have known. That's what leadership means. Knowing what happens in your name. Being responsible for systems you create even when you're not in the room where they operate. The weight of her failure settled like concrete across Catherine's shoulders. All those quarterly earnings calls, all those board presentations celebrating efficiency gains and cost reductions. She'd rewarded managers who met deadlines and beat projections without ever asking how they'd achieved results that looked too good to be sustainable. Wallace had thrived because she'd created conditions where cutting corners brought bonuses, while asking uncomfortable questions brought no rewards at all. They photographed everything. Files, spreadsheets, the sick mathematics of choosing settlements over recalls. Catherine worked with mechanical efficiency, her hands moving through tasks while her mind processed implications that stretched beyond Wallace's criminality into her own complicity. Footsteps in the hallway froze them both. James killed the desk lamp with swift efficiency, and they pressed against the wall behind Wallace's door. The security guard's flashlight beam swept under the door frame, paused, continued down the corridor. Catherine counted heartbeats, waiting for the sound of keys, the door opening, discovery that would end their investigation before justice could form. The footsteps faded. James's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing once before releasing. They had 4 minutes left in their window. Catherine ejected the USB drive, returning it to the safe exactly as they'd found it. Wallace couldn't know they'd been here, couldn't prepare his defense before she could weaponize truth against his carefully constructed lies. They retraced their steps through dark corridors, exiting the same service entrance that had granted access. The rain had intensified, washing away any trace of their presence as they walked to James's truck parked 3 blocks away. Catherine sat in the passenger seat, the USB drive containing copies of everything feeling heavy in her pocket despite its physical lightness. 17 names. 17 families who'd lost someone because Wallace had decided human lives cost less than proper engineering. What now? James's question carried weight beyond its simple words. They had evidence, but evidence alone wouldn't guarantee justice, not when Wallace still controlled the narrative and had allies throughout Technova's power structure. Now we make sure he can't bury this like he buried everything else. 3 days later, Catherine stood in James's kitchen organizing files for FBI delivery when her phone rang. Sophie's school. The principal's voice carried professional concern that made Catherine's blood turn to ice water. Miss Brennan, there was an incident during pickup. A man tried to collect Sophie Morrison, claiming to be her uncle. When we questioned him about the security password, he left quickly. Catherine's hand tightened on the phone, hard enough that the case creaked. Is Sophie safe? She's fine, but there's another issue. Grace Brennan is missing from aftercare. She was signed out by a woman claiming to be your assistant. The woman had proper ID and knew the security password. The world tilted sideways. Catherine gripped the counter, her vision narrowing to a tunnel that contained only the principal's next words. What do you mean, missing? She was picked up an hour ago. We assumed you'd authorized it. The woman had all the proper credentials. Catherine ended the call, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial James's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice already tense, as if he'd sensed catastrophe before it arrived. Someone tried to take Sophie. They got Grace. Silence on the line. Then James's voice, carrying battlefield calm that suggested he'd expected escalation, even if hoping otherwise. I'm 10 minutes away. Don't do anything until I get there. Those 10 minutes stretched into hours, measured in heartbeats and scenarios Catherine's imagination conjured with savage efficiency. Grace scared. Grace hurt. Grace calling for her mother while strangers explained that Catherine's investigation had made her daughter a target. James arrived with tactical gear Catherine hadn't known he owned. Weapons, communication equipment, the particular arsenal of someone who'd prepared for violence while hoping never to need it again. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Catherine answered with hands that had stopped shaking and started burning. Ms. Brennan, Wallace's voice carried the smooth satisfaction of someone who'd finally cornered his opponent and intended to savor the victory. You seem to have misplaced something valuable. Catherine's vision went red at the edges, rage providing focus that terror couldn't match. Where is she? Safe for now. But that could change if certain files don't return to where they belong. All copies. All evidence. You have 24 hours. James gestured for her to put the call on speaker. Catherine complied, her free hand clenched into a fist so tight her nails drew blood from her palm. If you've touched our daughters, James's voice carried the particular quiet that suggested violence barely leashed. Wallace's laugh held no humor. Mr. Morrison, always the hero. But this time, heroics won't help. This is business. Return what you stole, and the children go home unharmed. Refuse,
and you'll learn exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect what I've built.
Taking children isn't business, it's a federal crime. Catherine's voice emerged steadier than she felt. Wallace's tone hardened with the brittleness of someone who'd already crossed lines that eliminated retreat. So is corporate espionage, industrial sabotage, breaking and entering into executive offices to steal proprietary information. Shall I continue listing your crimes, Catherine? Or shall we acknowledge that we're both operating outside the law now, and the only question is who breaks first? His words landed with terrible accuracy. Catherine had broken laws, had stolen files, had committed offenses that Wallace could prosecute if he chose to weaponize the legal system against her. But he'd taken Grace, and that transformed every calculation into simple mathematics. Nothing mattered except getting her daughter back. Where? Warehouse on Canton Street. 1 hour. Come alone. Bring everything you took, and we'll make the exchange like civilized people conducting civilized business. The call ended, leaving silence that felt like suffocation. Catherine's chest constricted around breath that wouldn't quite fill her lungs. Grace. Alone. Scared. Paying the price for Catherine's investigation and Wallace's corruption, and every decision that had led to this moment where a daughter's safety depended on a mother's choice between justice and love. It's a trap, James stated the obvious with tactical assessment that acknowledged reality without surrendering to it. Catherine turned to face him, seeing warrior beneath mechanic's exterior, the man who'd survived combat and loss and career destruction and somehow maintained the capacity to care about someone else's child. I don't care. Grace is alone with him, with people who've already shown they'll use violence. I have to go. Then we go prepared. James made a call that Catherine didn't quite hear, speaking in the clipped military language that communicated volumes in syllables. When he hung up, his expression had shifted into something that would have terrified her if it wasn't directed at Wallace. My former teammate Jake works for the FBI now, Corporate Crimes Division. He's been investigating Technova for months, based on anonymous tips about safety violations. Understanding dawned like sunrise after the longest night. James had been feeding information to federal investigators even before Catherine had started her own investigation. He'd been building a case, patient and methodical, waiting for the moment when Wallace's arrogance would provide the opening justice required. Can he help? He can surround that warehouse with agents who'll document everything Wallace says and does. But we need to get him talking. Need a confession on record that ties him to the kidnapping, the cover-ups, everything. James pulled a small device from his gear bag, holding it up to the light. A pendant, innocuous and elegant, the kind of jewelry Catherine might have worn to board meetings in her former life. It's a tracker and microphone, FBI grade. You wear this, and Jake's team will hear everything. They'll know exactly where you are, exactly what's happening. Catherine took the pendant, its weight feeling both insignificant and massive. Her daughter's life depending on electronics and federal agents who might be minutes too late if Wallace decided violence served his purposes better than negotiation. What if he searches me? What if he finds it? He won't. It's designed to look like jewelry, and Wallace is arrogant enough to think he's already won. James helped her fasten the pendant around her neck, his scarred hands gentle despite their capacity for violence. His eyes met hers, and Catherine saw something there that hadn't existed during the parking garage rescue or her first visit to his shop. Respect, maybe, or recognition that she'd transformed from CEO who'd destroyed him into partner willing to risk everything for truth. I can't lose her. She's all I have. The admission emerged raw, stripped of corporate polish. James's expression softened into understanding that came from his own loss, his own knowledge of what it meant to face the world's cruelty while protecting what mattered most. You won't, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Catherine thought of all the times she'd trusted wrong people. Wallace, board members who'd abandoned her, systems that had failed repeatedly. But James had saved her life when he had every reason to walk past, had offered shelter when he could have let her learn what homelessness tasted like, had taught her daughter competence, while Catherine had taught her nothing except that mothers disappeared into offices and promises came with asterisks. I don't deserve your trust. This isn't about deserve. Can you trust me or not? The question cut through Catherine's self-recrimination to something simpler. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just the practical reality that Grace needed her mother to make a choice that put faith in someone else's competence. Yes. The warehouse on Canton Street occupied industrial space that had seen better decades. Chain-link fencing surrounded loading docks where legitimate business had given way to vacancy and the particular desolation of places where commerce had died. Catherine parked where instructed, the USB drive containing Wallace's crimes heavy in her pocket despite its negligible weight. The pendant rested against her collarbone, its presence both comfort and terror. Federal agents surrounding the building in darkness, or Wallace's people, waiting to ensure no witnesses survived whatever conclusion he'd planned. She walked toward the warehouse entrance, each step feeling like descent into something she might not survive. The door stood open, light spilling from interior spaces that smelled of rust and abandonment. Catherine crossed the threshold, her eyes adjusting to harsh fluorescent illumination that painted everything in shades of industrial despair. Wallace stood in a cleared area at the warehouse's center, flanked by two men Catherine recognized from the parking garage attack. Professional muscle, hired competence that transformed corporate corruption into physical threat. Behind them, Grace sat on a folding chair, her face pale but composed in ways that made Catherine's heart break and swell simultaneously. Her daughter hadn't cried, hadn't collapsed, had somehow maintained the kind of brave face that 8-year-olds shouldn't need to develop. "Mommy!" Grace's voice cracked on the word, terror bleeding through attempted composure. Catherine wanted to run to her, to gather her daughter close and promise safety that circumstances wouldn't support. But Wallace raised one hand, a gesture that froze Catherine's movement with its implicit threat. "Not yet. First, we conclude our business." His smile carried the smooth satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated victory and intended to savor it. Catherine forced herself to breathe, to remember James's coaching about staying calm, about getting Wallace talking, about FBI agents listening to every word through the pendant broadcasting against her racing pulse. "Let her go. I brought what you wanted." Catherine held up the USB drive, arm extended, the gesture feeling like surrender, even though she knew copies existed in federal hands. Wallace's eyes tracked the device with satisfaction that suggested he believed this moment marked his final victory over inconvenient questions. The great Catherine Brennan, reduced to begging for her daughter's life. How far you've fallen. His mockery landed deliberately, designed to wound, to establish dominance through humiliation. Catherine swallowed pride that had sustained her through 2 decades of corporate warfare, choosing Grace's safety over ego that suddenly felt ridiculous against actual stakes. "I'm not begging. I'm negotiating. You want the files, I want my daughter. Let's make the exchange and end this." Wallace's expression shifted into something uglier, the civilized mask slipping to reveal contempt that had probably always lurked beneath his smooth presentations. "You really think it's that simple? That I let you walk away with everything you know? Everything you've seen? You're not that naive, Catherine. Or perhaps you are. Perhaps that's how you became CEO in the first place. Pretty face, board connections, just smart enough to follow directions, but not smart enough to ask where they led." Catherine's jaw clenched against responses that would satisfy ego but endanger Grace. "Keep him talking," James had said. "Let him confess. Let arrogance become evidence." "Then what do you want? You're already facing federal investigation. Taking Grace just added kidnapping to your list of crimes." "Federal investigation!" Wallace's laugh held genuine amusement, as if Catherine had told a particularly good joke. You mean the one Richard Carlson is handling? My former roommate at Yale, who owes his federal appointment to recommendations I made. That investigation? His revelation landed like a blow. The system was more corrupt than Catherine had imagined, Wallace's influence extending into agencies that should have been investigating him. But the pendant still broadcast, and somewhere in the darkness, Jake Morrison and his FBI team were documenting everything. You've thought of everything. I built Technova. Not you, not the board, me. I made every hard decision while you played CEO, smiling for cameras and giving interviews about female leadership. You were always just the acceptable face we put on the company. Young, attractive, the kind of diversity hire that made stockholders feel progressive, while I ran the actual business. His words carried venom that suggested years of resentment, of watching Catherine receive credit while he operated in shadows. Catherine absorbed his contempt, recognizing that his arrogance was providing exactly what federal prosecutors would need. Then you built it on corpses. 17 people dead from medical devices you knew were defective. How many more would have died if I hadn't started asking questions? Wallace's expression hardened, and for the first time, Catherine saw something that might have been actual concern beneath his smooth confidence. Those deaths were acceptable business losses, statistically insignificant against the lives saved by our other products. You don't understand how these calculations work, Catherine. You never did. That's why you were never really qualified to lead. And kidnapping children? Is that acceptable business too? Leverage. You created the situation by refusing to understand your role, by deciding that investigation mattered more than the company's reputation, by choosing to destroy what I built instead of trusting that I knew what I was doing. His logic twisted reality into shapes that served his narrative, transforming kidnapping into reasonable response to Catherine's unreasonable questions. She'd encountered this kind of thinking in boardrooms, the smooth justifications that made cruelty sound like strategy. You're right about one thing. I didn't understand my role. I thought being CEO meant maximizing shareholder value. Turns out, it means protecting people from executives like you. Wallace's hand moved toward his jacket, and Catherine's body tensed for violence that felt inevitable. But headlights swept across the warehouse's high windows, and the sound of vehicle doors slamming echoed through industrial space. Federal agents! Everyone on the ground! The warehouse erupted into controlled chaos. Tactical teams flooded through multiple entrances, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands that transformed Wallace's carefully staged confrontation into crime scene. His hired muscle reached for weapons that never cleared holsters before agents forced them to the concrete with the efficient brutality of law enforcement that had prepared for resistance. Wallace lunged for Catherine, his hand closing around her arm with grip that would leave bruises. She'd learned from James, though. Her elbow found his solar plexus with precision that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't quite fill lungs she'd just emptied. A figure appeared from the shadows behind a shipping container. James, his movements carrying the particular efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for exactly the right moment. His hand found Wallace's shoulder, applying pressure to the nerve cluster that made Wallace's entire arm go limp with pain that transcended simple force. Don't touch her again. James's voice carried the flat certainty of someone capable of much worse violence if circumstances justified it. Wallace collapsed completely, his smooth confidence finally shattered against consequences he'd spent years avoiding. Catherine ran to Grace, her daughter's arms wrapping around her waist with fierce desperation. They sank to the concrete together, Catherine's hands checking for injuries, her voice repeating apologies that couldn't undo terror, but might acknowledge its reality. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let this happen. Grace's face pressed against Catherine's shoulder, her small body trembling with fear, finally permitted expression now that rescue had arrived. You saved me, Mommy. The words didn't match reality, but Catherine understood what her daughter meant. Not that Catherine had prevented the kidnapping, that she'd come. That when Grace needed her, Catherine had appeared, despite fear and danger, and Wallace's certainty that maternal love could be weaponized into surrender. No, sweetheart. We saved each other. Federal agents processed the scene with bureaucratic efficiency, taking statements and documenting evidence. Jake Morrison appeared, his resemblance to James marked enough that Catherine understood their relationship before introductions. He knelt beside where Catherine still held Grace, his expression carrying professional concern tempered by satisfaction. We got everything. Wallace's confession about the medical devices, his admission about corrupting the federal investigation, kidnapping charges, obstruction of justice. He's looking at decades. Catherine nodded, exhaustion finally claiming space that adrenaline had occupied. Grace had fallen asleep in her arms. The particular collapse that follows terror survived. Catherine held her daughter, feeling the weight that had always been there, but she'd rarely taken time to notice. James approached after giving his own statement, his dark eyes finding Catherine's across the warehouse's harsh lighting. He did good. His approval meant more than it should have, more than board commendations or magazine profiles or any recognition Catherine had received during her corporate ascent. She'd faced the man who'd threatened her daughter, had survived his contempt and arrogance, had helped secure confession that would prevent future victims from paying the price of Wallace's calculations. I just told the truth. That's all any of us can do. 2 days later, Catherine sat at James's kitchen table while Bradley arrived with files Catherine had requested. Her former assistant looked uncomfortable in the working-class neighborhood, his tailored suit marking him as visitor from different economic ecosystem. The board is offering reinstatement, full back pay, public apology. They want you back, Miss Brennan. Bradley delivered the news with the efficiency of someone accustomed to bearing messages that reshaped executive careers. Catherine read the formal letter, noting the careful language that acknowledged mistakes while minimizing board culpability. Tell them no. Bradley's eyebrows rose, professional composure cracking. No? They're offering you everything. Your position, your reputation, everything Wallace took. Catherine set down the letter, her eyes finding Grace and Sophie playing in the living room. Her daughter laughed at something Sophie said, the sound bright and uncomplicated in ways Catherine had forgotten were possible. I don't want it. I'm exactly where I need to be. After Bradley left, confused but obedient, James emerged from the bedroom where he'd been giving Catherine privacy for the conversation. His expression held question he didn't quite voice. You turned them down? Yes. Why? Catherine considered the question, examining motivations that had crystallized over weeks of living in his apartment, watching him parent with patience she'd never developed, learning that competence measured in locked, picked, and daughters kept safe mattered more than corner offices. Because I finally understand what's worth protecting. And it's not a title. Her phone buzzed. News alert. Federal agents had arrested additional Technova executives implicated in Wallace's schemes. The investigation was expanding, touching board members who'd enabled corruption through willful blindness Catherine recognized in herself. But there was other news, too. A second USB drive that Bradley had quietly delivered, files Catherine hadn't seen during the warehouse confrontation. Medical device death toll updated. 17 confirmed, with evidence suggesting 12 more deaths that Wallace had successfully hidden through settlements binding families to silence. 29 people, dead because Wallace had calculated that human lives cost less than engineering fixes. Catherine read the names, absorbing weight she'd carry regardless of whether prosecutors secured convictions. These deaths had happened under her leadership, in systems she'd created, through negligence she'd enabled by rewarding efficiency without examining its costs. I need to testify. Against Wallace. Against the board. Against myself. James looked up from where he'd been reviewing Phoenix Response Center plans, the training facility they'd started designing during quiet evenings after Grace and Sophie went to sleep. Against yourself? I enabled this culture. Rewarded managers who cut corners. Fired you for choosing people over protocols. I'm complicit in creating the environment where Wallace could thrive. James studied her face, reading determination that had replaced the CEO certainty she'd worn like armor. You don't have to do this. Wallace is the criminal. You were just willfully blind? Conveniently ignorant? Those aren't defenses. They're indictments. Catherine stood, her decision crystallizing into action that felt both terrifying and necessary. She'd spent 2 decades building success on foundations of sand, trusting systems that served her comfort while failing people she'd never bothered to see. Time to face what she'd created. Time to own consequences that extended beyond quarterly reports into morgues and funeral homes and families who'd lost people to devices that never should have shipped. That has to mean something. James nodded slowly, respect building in his expression. It does. 1 week later, federal agents arrived at James's apartment with warrant that made Catherine's chest constrict despite expecting this outcome. Wallace had filed charges, claiming Catherine had tampered with evidence, coerced witnesses, committed corporate espionage in service of personal vendetta. The FBI agent who read her rights had the courtesy to look apologetic, but handcuffs felt the same regardless of the arresting officer's sympathy. Grace watched from Sophie's bedroom doorway, her face white with fear that stabbed deeper than any physical pain Catherine had endured. "Mommy?" Catherine met her daughter's eyes, refusing to look away from terror she'd caused through choices that had seemed justified at the time. "It's okay, baby. This is just temporary. Mr. Morrison will take care of you." James stood beside Grace, his hands settling on her shoulder with the protective instinct Catherine had learned to trust. He nodded once, promise conveyed without words that Grace would be safe while Catherine faced consequences of investigation that had exposed truth at the cost of everything she'd built. As federal agents led Catherine toward their vehicle, she turned back to James one final time. "Don't stop. Keep building the center. This is bigger than me." Her words carried weight beyond their simple syllables. For the first time in her life, Catherine was choosing mission over self-preservation, principle over comfort, the radical notion that some battles were worth fighting even when victory meant personal destruction. James's expression softened into something that looked like pride, and Catherine carried that image with her into the federal vehicle that would transport her to processing and charges and whatever justice demanded from executives who'd learned too late what leadership actually required. The holding cell smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. Catherine sat on the metal bench, her expensive clothes ridiculous against concrete walls designed for people society had decided to contain. 48 hours since federal agents had led her from James's apartment in handcuffs. 48 hours of processing and fingerprints and the particular humiliation of being photographed for criminal records that would follow her forever. 2 years ago, she'd been on magazine covers, Forbes, Fortune, the kind of publications that celebrated female executives who'd shattered glass ceilings through determination and ruthless focus. Now she occupied space reserved for people who'd broken laws in pursuit of truth that should have been accessible without requiring criminal trespass. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song. Catherine leaned her head against the wall, feeling its coolness through hair that hadn't been washed in 2 days. Grace was with James and Sophie, safe in ways that mattered more than Catherine's freedom. That calculation felt simple in ways her corporate math had never achieved. A correctional officer appeared at the cell door, keys jangling against her belt. "Brennan, you made bail." Catherine stood, her body protesting after hours on the unforgiving bench. The processing reversed itself with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had admitted her. Personal effects returned, release papers signed, instructions about court appearances delivered in monotone that suggested the officer had recited them thousands of times to people who rarely remembered the details that mattered. James waited in the lobby, Grace asleep in his arms, despite the uncomfortable plastic chairs that served as waiting area furniture. His eyes found Catherine's, and something passed between them that required no words. Relief. Acknowledgement. The particular understanding that develops between people who've survived crisis together. Catherine crossed to them, her hands finding Grace's sleeping face, tracing features that looked peaceful despite everything her daughter had witnessed in recent weeks.
They dropped the charges. Wallace overreached. Federal prosecutor saw through his attempt to weaponize the legal system. James's expression shifted into satisfaction that stopped short of triumph. But the damage is done. His assessment landed with accuracy Catherine couldn't dispute. News coverage had painted her as a corporate criminal, former CEO who'd stolen proprietary information and coerced witnesses in service of personal vendetta. Wallace's spin had worked, even as his own legal situation deteriorated. Public opinion had turned against her with the speed of social media outrage that never waited for complete stories. They drove back to James's apartment through Dallas streets that felt different now that Catherine had seen them from inside a police vehicle.
The city she'd once navigated from penthouse heights looked sharper from ground level, its inequalities more visible when you weren't insulated by wealth and power. Grace stirred as they parked, her eyes opening to find her mother's face. "You came back." The simple statement contained volumes. Catherine pulled her daughter close, breathing in the soap and sleep smell of her hair. "I'll always come back to you." The promise felt heavier than any contract Catherine had signed during her corporate career, because this one she intended to keep, regardless of circumstances that might make it difficult. Morning brought news that Wallace's legal team had filed additional motions, attempting to delay trial through procedural warfare that expensive lawyers deployed when facts didn't favor their clients. Catherine read the updates on her phone while drinking coffee that James had made too strong, a detail she'd learned not to mention because criticism felt ungrateful when someone was providing shelter you didn't deserve. Tom Bennett's contact information appeared in files Bradley had quietly compiled before disappearing from Catherine's life with the speed of assistant who recognized that association with scandal damaged careers. Catherine stared at the number, considering whether she had any right to call the man whose life she'd helped destroy by trusting Wallace's smooth lies. She dialed before courage could fail. Tom answered on the third ring, his voice carrying wariness that suggested he'd seen Catherine's name on caller ID and debated whether to ignore it. "Ms. Brennan." "Mr. Bennett, I know I have no right to call you, but I need to tell you something." Silence on the line. Catherine imagined him in whatever life he'd built after the Texas explosion, after Wallace had forced him to lie about James, after settlement money had bought his silence at the cost of his integrity. "I'm the one who fired James Morrison. I'm the one who believed Wallace's lies without investigating. I'm the one who created the system where what happened to you could happen at all. And I'm here to make it right." More silence. Then Tom's voice, rougher than before. "Why should I trust you? You signed the papers that destroyed a good man's career. You enabled Wallace for years. Now you want absolution because it's convenient?" Catherine absorbed his anger, recognizing its justice. "You shouldn't trust me, but trust that I won't stop until Wallace pays for what he did to all of us. And trust that I'm willing to testify about my own failures, if that's what it takes." The pause stretched long enough that Catherine thought he might hang up. Then Tom's breath released in something between laugh and sob. "Federal prosecutor contacted me yesterday. Asked if I'd testify about the settlement. About Wallace forcing me to blame myself for the explosion." "What did you tell him?" "That I needed to think about it. That my family depends on money I took to stay quiet." Catherine understood the calculation he faced. Integrity versus stability. Truth versus security for people you loved. "I can't promise you won't lose the settlement, but I can promise that doing the right thing matters more than I understood for most of my life. And I learned that from James Morrison, the man we both failed." Tom's voice cracked when he spoke again. "All right, I'll testify.
Not for you. For him. Because he deserves better than what we gave him. The trial began 6 weeks later in federal courthouse that smelled of marble and justice that sometimes arrived too late to prevent suffering.
Catherine sat in the gallery beside Grace, watching prosecutors build their case against Wallace with methodical precision that transformed corporate malfeasance into criminal enterprise. Day 1 brought financial experts who detailed how Wallace had systematically buried safety reports across 5 facilities. Day 2 presented engineers who'd warned about medical device flaws only to see their concerns disappear into administrative black holes. The evidence accumulated like stones, each one adding weight to the structure of Wallace's guilt. Day 3 arrived with Catherine's name on the witness list. She'd spent the previous night preparing testimony with federal prosecutors who'd been surprised by her willingness to detail her own failures. Most witnesses tried to minimize their culpability. Catherine wanted hers documented completely. The courtroom fell silent as she took the stand, right hand raised, swearing to tell truth she'd avoided for too long. The prosecutor began with simple questions designed to establish basic facts. Ms. Brennan, you were CEO of Technova Solutions when the Texas plant explosion occurred? I was. And you terminated James Morrison following that incident? I did. On what basis? Catherine's throat tightened, but she forced the words out clearly. On a lie. Richard Wallace told me James violated protocol by prioritizing human life over company property. I never investigated. I never asked James his side of the story. I signed the termination papers because I wanted to appear decisive to the board, because trusting Wallace's presentation was easier than doing the work of understanding what actually happened. The courtroom absorbed her admission with the kind of silence that precedes thunder. Catherine saw Wallace's defense attorney making notes, already planning how to use her confession against the prosecution's case. But truth mattered more than tactical advantage now. You're saying you fired Mr. Morrison without conducting your own investigation? Yes. I delegated that responsibility to Wallace, the same man who'd created the conditions that caused the explosion in the first place. I trusted his smooth competence, because questioning would have required effort I deemed better spent elsewhere. The prosecutor let the pause extend, giving the jury time to absorb implications. And what have you learned since then about the Texas incident? Catherine detailed everything. Wallace's emails authorizing safety bypasses, Tom Bennett's real incident report that contradicted the official narrative, the systematic cover-up that had blamed victims for failures created by management's corner-cutting. Defense attorney rose for cross-examination with the predatory confidence of someone who'd found weakness to exploit. Isn't it convenient, Ms. Brennan, that you're now blaming Mr. Wallace for decisions you made as CEO? The question landed exactly as intended, painting her testimony as self-serving revision of history. Catherine met the attorney's eyes without flinching. No, it's painful, because I enabled Wallace for years. I created a culture at Technova where profit mattered more than people, where managers who cut corners received bonuses, while those who asked uncomfortable questions received nothing. I'm not innocent in this. I'm complicit. But I'm here to tell the truth about my failures and his crimes, because the difference between us is that I'm willing to admit what I did wrong. The attorney tried different approaches, attempting to paint Catherine as bitter ex-executive seeking revenge after losing her position. Each attack gave her opportunity to detail new failures, to catalog ways she'd prioritized appearance over substance, quarterly earnings over human safety. Finally, the prosecutor asked the question that would define Catherine's testimony.
Ms. Brennan, why are you here? Why testify against your own company, destroy your own reputation, detail your own failures for public record?
Catherine's hands gripped the witness box railing, her eyes finding Grace in the gallery. Her daughter watched with the serious attention of someone learning what integrity looked like when it cost everything.
Because 17 people are dead. Because I fired a good man for doing the right thing. Because my daughter almost died in a parking garage because I was too blind to see what was happening under my leadership.
Her voice steadied despite tears that blurred vision.
I built Technova on a foundation of convenience and ambition. It took losing everything to understand that real leadership means protecting people, not profit margins. I won't let one more person die because I was too proud to admit I was wrong. That's why I'm here, not for redemption.
For accountability. The courtroom remained silent as Catherine stepped down, her testimony complete. She'd said everything that mattered, confessed every failure that haunted her. The weight felt lighter now that truth had been spoken, even if consequences would follow for years. Day 4 brought James to the witness stand. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, borrowed from Jake for the occasion, his military bearing evident despite civilian clothes. The prosecutor established his credentials quickly: Navy SEAL, decorated veteran, 6 years as Technova's safety director with performance reviews that documented excellence. Then the Texas incident, James's account matching Catherine's in every detail except tone. Where she'd detailed her failures, he simply stated facts. Wallace had ordered safety bypasses, Tom Bennett had been trapped, James had chosen rescue over protocol. The equipment was already compromised by shortcuts that made its destruction inevitable. Defense attorney tried to paint him as vengeful employee seeking to destroy Wallace's reputation. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you harbored resentment toward Mr. Wallace for 2 years? That this testimony is motivated by desire for revenge? James's expression remained neutral, his scarred hands folded calmly on the witness box railing. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because Miss Brennan asked me to tell the truth. And unlike 2 years ago, someone's finally listening. His answer landed with the weight of someone who'd already processed anger and moved beyond it into something deeper. The defense had no response that wouldn't make their client look worse. Day 5 brought Tom Bennett, and Catherine watched from the gallery as he detailed Wallace's coercion, the settlement that had bought silence, the threats that had forced him to testify falsely against James, the years of guilt that had accumulated while he'd taken money that felt increasingly like payment for soul sold. When Tom finished his prepared testimony, he turned toward where James sat in the gallery. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry. You saved my life, and I repaid you by lying about what happened. I was afraid for my family. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. You deserved better. James nodded once, acknowledgement without absolution, letting Tom carry the weight of his own choices while recognizing the circumstances that had made them feel inevitable. Days 6 and 7 brought the medical device evidence, engineering reports Wallace had buried, cost-benefit analyses that treated human lives as acceptable losses, email chains documenting his conscious choice to let defective equipment ship rather than incur recall expenses. Families of the 17 confirmed victims filled the courtroom gallery. Catherine watched them absorb details of how their loved ones had died, how Wallace had known about design flaws and chosen profit over safety. During a recess, she approached them with the kind of dread that felt appropriate for facing consequences she should have prevented. I'm Catherine Brennan. I was CEO when your loved ones died. The nearest woman, mid-40s, with eyes that had known grief too intimately, stared at Catherine with expression that mixed anger and exhaustion. You're the one who let this happen. Yes. The simple admission stopped whatever response the woman had been preparing. Around them, other family members turned to listen, their faces carrying variations of the same pain. I can't undo what happened. I can't bring them back. But I'm committing every resource I have left to make sure it never happens again. We're building a training center that will teach executives and workers about real safety, about accountability that goes beyond paperwork. A man in his 60s, hands trembling with age or emotion, or both, stepped closer. Why should we believe you? You had power to stop this before our daughter died. Why would you do anything now that you've lost everything? Catherine met his eyes, refusing to look away from the pain she'd enabled through negligence. Because I have a daughter too. And I finally understand what's worth protecting. Not quarterly earnings, not stock prices. People. The ones who go to work expecting to come home. The ones whose families shouldn't have to bury them because executives decided profit mattered more than safety. The woman who'd spoken first studied Catherine's face, searching for sincerity beneath corporate polish that had been stripped away by recent weeks. Our mother was 61. She'd just become a grandmother. The device failed during routine monitoring. They said it was user error, equipment malfunction, anything except admitting they'd sold hospitals defective products. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate. But I'm here, and I'll keep being here, doing the work that might prevent another family from losing someone they love. The families didn't forgive her. Catherine didn't expect absolution, but they nodded, recognition passing between people who'd all lost something to Wallace's calculations and were all trying to find meaning in loss that would never make sense. The verdict arrived after 3 days of jury deliberation. Catherine sat in the gallery, Grace's hand tight in hers, as the foreman stood to deliver judgment on charges that had accumulated over weeks of testimony. On the count of 17 counts of negligent homicide, we find the defendant Richard Wallace guilty. The litany continued: conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, kidnapping. Each guilty verdict adding weight to consequences that would define the remainder of Wallace's life. His face crumbled as the verdicts mounted. The smooth confidence that had characterized his corporate ascent finally shattered against accountability he'd spent years avoiding. Around the courtroom, families of victims wept with a complicated relief of justice that couldn't restore what they'd lost, but at least acknowledged their losses mattered. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Patricia Henderson, 63 with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many corporate criminals receive wrist slaps, showed no mercy in her remarks. Mr. Wallace, you held positions of trust and authority. You use that authority not to protect those under your care, but to exploit them for personal gain and company profit. 17 people are dead because you chose convenience over safety. Countless others were harmed by your systematic cover-ups and willingness to weaponize the legal system against anyone who threatened your control. She paused, letting silence emphasize what followed. I sentence you to 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. You will have substantial time to reflect on the true cost of your choices. Outside the courthouse, Catherine delivered a statement to press that had gathered to document Wallace's fall. Cameras clicked and microphones thrust forward as she spoke words she'd rehearsed but still felt inadequate. Justice was served today, but it doesn't bring back the 17 people we lost. It doesn't undo the harm done to James Morrison and his family, to Tom Bennett, to everyone who suffered because corporate culture prioritized profit over human safety. True accountability means building something better. That's what we're committed to doing. James found her after the reporters dispersed, his expression carrying satisfaction, tempered by recognition that convictions couldn't erase damage already done. You did good in there. Catherine shook her head, still processing the weight of testimony she'd delivered. I just told the truth. You taught me that matters. His dark eyes found hers with intensity that made looking away feel like cowardice. I didn't teach you anything. You learned it yourself. That's harder. That required choosing humility over pride, accountability over self-preservation. Don't diminish what you did. 3 months later, Phoenix Response Center held its second opening. This time, no federal raids interrupted, no arrests, just quiet gathering of people who'd contributed to its resurrection through volunteer labor and donated materials and belief that workplaces could prioritize human life without sacrificing productivity. The building James and Catherine had renovated occupied the same space that had once seemed too small for their ambitions. Now, it felt perfectly sized. Training rooms equipped with safety equipment, simulation areas where workers could practice emergency responses, offices where executives could learn accountability frameworks that measured success in lives protected rather than corners cut. Catherine stood before the assembled crowd, her speech brief because elaborate presentations felt wrong for occasion that should center work rather than words. This center exists because I failed, Because I chose quarterly reports over human lives. Because I destroyed a good man's career without asking questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths. She paused, letting honesty settle over audience that included former Technova employees, families of victims, community members who'd seen too many workplace injuries. James Morrison taught me that safety isn't about protocols on paper. It's about remembering that every worker has a family waiting for them to come home. Every person who clocks in deserves to clock out whole. That simple truth got lost in my pursuit of success that looked impressive in business journals, but failed basic tests of human decency. Grace and Sophie stood near the front, holding the banner they'd painted together. Phoenix Response Center, because every life matters. Their artwork showed people helping each other, stick figures rendered with the earnest precision of children who believed adults should care about simple truths. Phoenix Response Center is my apology, not to James Morrison, though he deserves far more than I can offer, but to every person I failed when I had power. We're teaching executives what I wish someone had taught me before I had authority to damage lives. Your job isn't maximizing shareholder value. It's protecting the people who build your success. The crowd applauded, but Catherine found herself watching James instead. He stood at the back, his scarred hands folded, his expression carrying pride that felt unearned, but she accepted anyway, because refusing his respect would dishonor the journey they'd shared. Later, after the formal program concluded and people circulated through training rooms examining equipment, Catherine found James reviewing schedules for upcoming classes. Director of Training, the title she'd offered when they'd formalized the center's structure. I offered you CEO. You said no. His mouth curved into something approaching amusement. I don't want a title. I want to do the work. Teach people skills that keep them safe. Build culture where asking questions doesn't end careers. That matters more than any nameplate. Catherine understood. She'd spent 20 years climbing toward titles that meant less than she'd imagined. Phoenix Response Center operated with her as founder, but leadership was shared, decisions made collaboratively, success measured in students trained rather than revenue generated. Evenings settled over the center as students departed and volunteers finished cleanup. Catherine stood on the roof they'd converted into break area, watching Dallas lights spread like promises across darkness. James joined her, his presence familiar in ways that suggested comfort earned through shared crisis. You've built something good here. His assessment felt generous given how much he'd contributed, but Catherine had learned to accept compliments that acknowledged growth rather than dismissing them as undeserved. We built something. I just finally learned to listen instead of assuming I knew better. James pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple ring that probably cost less than Catherine's former dry cleaning budget, but felt more valuable than any jewelry she'd owned during her corporate ascent. I'm not good with speeches, but I know what matters. You, Grace, Sophie. This work we're doing. I want to make it official. Catherine's throat tightened around words that wouldn't quite form. 20 years she'd spent climbing the wrong mountain, building empire that had collapsed the moment she'd questioned its foundations. James had lost everything because she'd signed papers without asking questions. And now he stood before her, offering partnership that felt both impossible and inevitable. I spent 20 years becoming someone I'm ashamed of. I fired you because you chose people over protocol. And now you're asking me to marry you. Her tears fell freely, the kind that came from emotion too large for containment. James's scarred hand found her face, thumb wiping moisture that kept replacing itself. You're not the person who signed that letter anymore. You learned. You changed. You chose the harder path when easier ones were available. Thanks to you. No. Thanks to you choosing to change. I just showed you what was possible. You did the work of becoming different. Catherine's phone rang before she could respond, its screen showing Technova's corporate number. She considered ignoring it, But James nodded toward the device with expression that suggested answering might provide useful information. Janet Winters's voice carried the careful neutrality of a board member trying to navigate political waters. Catherine, the board met this evening. We'd like to offer you reinstatement as CEO. Full back pay. Public apology for our handling of your suspension. Everything Wallace took from you. The offer should have felt vindicating. Catherine had been right about Wallace's corruption, had exposed crimes the board had enabled through willful ignorance. They owed her more than position and money. But corporate apologies rarely extended to genuine contrition. No. Silence on the line, as if Janet couldn't process response that contradicted everything she understood about executive ambition. No? Catherine, we're offering you everything. Your reputation restored. Your career salvaged. Why would you refuse? Catherine looked at James, at the ring still in his hand, at the center below where students would arrive tomorrow to learn safety practices that prioritized human life. Because I don't want it. I'm exactly where I need to be, teaching others not to make my mistakes, building systems that protect people instead of profit margins. That's worth more than any corner office. She ended the call before Janet could marshal arguments that might have swayed the person Catherine used to be. James's expression held question and answer simultaneously, understanding that she'd chosen different definition of success. You just turned down everything you worked for. I turned down everything I thought I wanted. Turns out, I was working toward the wrong goals for 20 years. They stood together as Dallas settled into night, the city continuing its endless motion below them. Grace's voice called from downstairs, asking if they could show Sophie the memorial garden before going home. Catherine descended to find both girls waiting, their faces bright with the kind of uncomplicated affection that suggested they'd already decided their families would merge, regardless of adult complications. The memorial garden occupied space behind the center where James had planted flowers Catherine couldn't name, but Grace had helped select. 17 stone markers, each bearing a name and dates that marked lives cut short by Wallace's calculations. Catherine placed fresh flowers at each marker, a ritual she'd adopted to remind herself why this work mattered beyond personal redemption. Grace studied the stones with serious attention. Who are they, Mommy? People who deserved better. People who remind me why we do this work every day. Why we teach safety that actually protects instead of just checking boxes. Why we build culture where asking uncomfortable questions is rewarded instead of punished. Sophie settled beside Grace, her hand finding her new sister's with the easy affection of children who'd bonded through shared trauma. Dad says heroes are just people who don't walk away. Catherine looked at James, seeing the man who'd had every reason to walk past a parking garage where his former CEO was being beaten, who'd had every justification for letting her investigation proceed without his help, who'd offered shelter when she'd had nowhere else to go. Your dad is very wise, and I'm still learning from him. They climbed to the rooftop together, all four of them, family assembled from wreckage and choice rather than biology. The evening air carried coolness that promised autumn's arrival. Below them, Dallas continued its ceaseless activity, millions of people pursuing their own definitions of success and meaning and worth. Catherine's phone buzzed. Different company this time, smaller manufacturing firm facing OSHA violations. The message asked if Phoenix Response Center provided emergency consultation for businesses trying to improve safety culture before federal investigators arrived. We should take that. James's expression shifted into the kind of assessment that suggested he was already thinking through logistics, scheduling, what resources they could deploy. We? His question held weight beyond its simple syllable. Catherine had spent 20 years making decisions alone, trusting her judgment without seeking input from people who might have prevented her worst failures. That approach had built empire on sand. I used to make decisions alone. Not anymore. What do you think? James smiled, the expression transforming his face in ways that suggested healing extended beyond physical scars. I think we help. Catherine looked at Grace and Sophie, at the center they'd built from conviction that human life mattered more than quarterly earnings, at the man whose career she'd destroyed and who'd somehow found capacity to forgive her failure through recognizing her transformation. I spent 20 years building an empire on sand. It took losing everything to build a foundation on stone. The man I destroyed taught me how, and every day I get to teach others what I learned too late. That's not penance, that's purpose, and it's worth more than any throne I ever sat on. The city stretched below them, lights marking countless lives intersecting in ways both deliberate and accidental. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to teach lessons Catherine had learned through failure spectacular enough to destroy everything she'd built. But tonight, she stood with people who mattered more than market capitalization. Grace leaning against her side, Sophie holding James's hand. The four of them together, family forged from crisis into something that felt more real than anything Catherine had achieved during her corporate ascent. James slipped the ring onto her finger, its simple band catching light from the city below. Grace cheered with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a daughter watching her mother choose right path after years of wrong turns. Sophie hugged them both, her joy untainted by understanding of everything that had preceded this moment. And Catherine felt, for the first time in decades, that she'd arrived somewhere worth reaching. Not a corner office, not a magazine cover, but a rooftop in Dallas where people she loved gathered to do work that mattered, where safety meant protecting human life instead of corporate liability, where success measured itself in workers returning home whole rather than shareholders enriched. The choice between power and purpose had felt impossible when she'd had everything. Now, having lost it all and rebuilt on different foundations, the choice felt simple as breathing. She'd chosen purpose, and every day forward, she'd make that choice again.